Hey there. So just finished rewatching Star Trek Picard Season 2, Episode 2, Penance, for my series here where I'm going through talking about each episode. The episode starts off with the recap from the previous episode, which ends with the final words from the end of that episode where Q says, "Welcome to the end of the road not taken." And I thought that line sounds a little bit like it's supposed to mean something, so I gave it a quick look up. Apparently, The Road Not Taken is a poem by Robert Frost that uses the extended metaphor of a traveler in the woods to explore the impact of decisions or lack thereof. The poem is about the choices and opportunities in life and the sensation of regret that accompanies all the roads that a person doesn't take. So, a nice little appropriate reference, and also a nice little quip to put in at the transition point between episodes. Although, for a lot of people like myself, it's a bit of a lost reference if you aren't up on your classic literature. So, I guess within the immediate context up to this point in the episode, or this would be really the end of the last episode, I guess when Q says this, Picard's probably thinking about the decisions he just made that resulted in the Stargazer blowing up and all the Borg taking over. Maybe as well, Picard could have in the back of his head all the romantic relationships and the stuff that filled up a lot of episode one. Since, historically speaking, Q has had this kind of bizarre, giddy, mischievous interest in Picard's love life. And then immediately prior to that road not taken comment, we got some other references. We got Q reminding Picard that, quote, the trial never ends, referring to the last thing Q had said back at the end of The Next Generation. And then we got this reference to the idea of Picard wanting or needing a second chance. And then finally, the reference to Robert Frost, welcome to the end of the road not taken. So I guess Picard's probably thinking, okay, what kind of supposedly bad decisions is Q going to nail me for? Or maybe what kind of tapestry game is he going to throw at me? I'm referring to the episode Tapestry from The Next Generation, where Q appeared to Picard after Picard died, and then Q let him replay certain choices to see what happens. Kind of a It's a Wonderful Life sort of situation. Which incidentally was one of the first times Q he showed up seeming kind of relatively constructive and helpful rather than just annoying back in The Next Generation, which is kind of also how he looks at the end of this season of Picard. So kind of cool in that way. So that's within the immediate context, the situation Picard would have probably had in mind. And we could probably say the bigger significance of that reference would probably be in light of the season as a whole, as an introduction of various themes that'll play out over the course of the season, maybe about regrets and opportunities and the demons in your closet, so to speak, etc. But the rest of the season isn't nearly as fresh in my memory at this point, so I can't really get into that too much. Now, that being said, I do have to say, just backing up a little bit, these first two episodes of season two, just in general, don't seem to me to be very interesting or original or good quality storytelling. On my first watch through back when it came out, I was just kind of hanging on there, hanging in, trying not to judge, waiting for something good to happen. And the part where I did begin to be interested was definitely when Q showed up. And I think for both of these two opening episodes, if there is a redeeming part to their chaotic and uninspired mishmash of content, that redeeming part would have to be the performance of John Delancey here as Q. Now, I mean, it's not like I've ever been the biggest Q fan. I always thought most of the Q episodes in The Next Generation tended to be some of the less interesting TNG episodes, with the exception of the odd one here and there, like Tapestry, that was very compelling. And though in Voyager, Q did tend to become generally more interesting, but he still usually added that kind of nonsensical flavor to our beloved, more seamless Star Trek world. And then, not to mention, probably the biggest thing with Q is that, the characters tend to find him annoying. He acts kind of annoying. And so some of his fans just kind of feel that he is annoying. But here in this episode, the gravitas and theatrical presence that Q produces the moment he appears is just downright striking. Not to mention the fact that he really pulls off the elderly Q variation. The gray hair and the change of costume really goes superbly well with the gravitas and theatrical intensity that he brings on. Maybe you could say, for me, just as much as I became disengaged and disinterested during that cringeworthy Guinan scene from last episode, I was just as much suddenly engaged and interested the moment Q appeared. Just as annoying as that scene was in terms of impact and appropriateness to the established universe, that's how enjoyable I found this portrayal, to me at least. And also, I suppose you could also say that just as random and bizarre as everything that Guinan said in that scene, to the same extent, everything Q says here is kind of intriguingly kind of suggesting and seeming to point toward some kind of intelligent story trajectory. And even though you can't tell what that trajectory is going to be in your first watch, you can tell that there probably is one, and that's part of what keeps your attention, or at least for me. The visual aspect of some of these shots is also quite compelling. They gave Q a pretty epic looking costume, and there's a couple of shots in the vineyard with a really nice, kind of beautiful combination of landscape and camera angles with Q and Picard. That makes it really fun to watch and goes well with all the gravitas and mystery and intrigue surrounding the character of this new and mysterious version of Q. Probably the most memorable line in this sequence is Q's epic line that he spits out dramatically. "This isn't a lesson, it's a penance." Just like the road not taken line, this one really fills the air in an effective and theatrical kind of way and sticks in your memory, as well as coloring your expectations for what's going to happen. And of course, another part of what makes it intriguing and memorable is the fact that by the very end of the season, we're going to find out that it's not Picard's penance that's in view, although Q clearly intended to give Picard that impression, sneaky old Q, but it's actually Q's act of penance, his final good deed done before he finishes his time and goes off who knows where. My memory of the end of the season is a bit fuzzy, but that's how I'm remembering it right now. Anyway, since I've only seen season 2 once before this current time. Now, unfortunately, some of the cheesiness of the episode is still leaking through, even in some parts of some of the Q scenes. They kept on throwing in these cheesy little insider references that break the fourth wall and just make me cringe. The two that I jotted down, and I think there were more, but maybe it was just these two, but the two that I jotted down were when he says, "How yesterday's enterprise of you." And then later on when he walks into that one room and says, "Through a mirror darkly, and here the man who holds the mirror is darker still." So those kinds of things, they just kind of ruin the moment. Can't imagine what they were thinking, or who would think that putting episode titles into Q's mouth was a good idea. Maybe over in the Continuum, Q's just been sitting there with all his DVD cases sifting through, looking for one to watch because he's so bored with life as a Q. Yesterday's Enterprise? No, I saw that one last week. Through a Mirror Darkly? Nah, not in the mood for it. Oh, Kirk Meets the Gorn? Nah. And then finally, he just throws the DVD cases and says, "There's nothing good to watch. Why don't I go manipulate the space-time continuum?" And then when he does, the episode titles just come out of his mouth on accident. "Oh, Jean-Luc, how yesterday's Enterprise of you. I was thinking about watching that one, but I thought I'd come talk to you instead." In a similar vein, it really felt like kind of a weird, bizarre fan service when Q gave that "through the mirror darkly" line, and then suddenly we're in this room with the skulls of random fan favorite Star Trek characters with no relationship to each other. So apparently, Mirror Picard killed, or pardon me, this isn't the Mirror Universe, alternate Picard apparently decapitated Dukat, Martok, and Sarek. Okay. Here's what I jotted down while I was taking notes in the middle of that scene. You'll have to pardon the attitude. "This scene is so pretentious and absurd," the room with the skulls, "of an eye roll. If it wasn't for the dramatic music, it could have been a fun little farce or a thoughtful little Twilight Zone absurdity, but they leaned into it way too much with the music and intensity while cracking all those silly one-liners." Anyway, so after that, Q disappears, and then Harvey, the robot, appears. And then the opening scene finishes off after Harvey asks if Picard's all right, and Picard says, "No, I don't know who I am, but I'm not myself." And then that's the end of the teaser, and we get the nice little title sequence, which I do like quite a bit. It's basically just like a Borgified version of the season 1 title sequence, which I always loved. And it's just a nice and gentle and reflective little musical visual journey, which I really like quite a bit. When we come back, Picard is watching his old victory speech, and we get the memorable line at the end, "Because a safe galaxy is a human galaxy." And then a little bit later, memorable moment is when Picard takes a sip of his Colombian roast, black, instead of his good old Earl Grey, hot. And he gives this humorous little one-liner, "This really is the circle that Dante overlooks," referring to the circles of hell in Dante's Inferno, which I still haven't read, but would definitely like to at some point. It's on my long reading list. So we find out Laris and Juban were killed a long time ago in battle. We find out that it is Eradication Day. Then we go over to 7, or Annika, who just flips out like she's never had any crazy weird things happen before in her whole life. And really that scene, just like the rest of the episode, just kind of feels overblown and pretentious. But anyway, so then President Annika reaches out to Rios. Meanwhile, Rafi rescues Elnor from getting shot by the cops. And then we meet Girardi in her lab with her little talking cat, which is absolutely adorable. And I'd say Girardi's response to waking up in a mirror universe, oh, pardon me, in an alternate timeline, I'd say her response is quite a bit more believable. And then we meet the Borg Queen, which for me that's really the first intriguing moment since the appearance of Q. It's like, oh, look, it's the Borg Queen. It looks like the one I remember. uh, Picard meets up with Raffi and Elnor and Seven, tells them about Q. And then we get the moment where the Borg Queen tells us that the changes in the timeline happened through a single change that took place in 2024 in Los Angeles, and also that there is a watcher there to help, whatever that means. And she finishes with, seek the watcher. Bit of an odd way for the Borg Queen to talk, but well, there it is. Well, they can't beam away due to lockdown, so they have to go out on stage for the ceremony. And when the timing doesn't quite work out, they end up in a shootout. Surprise, surprise. And finally, Rios and Girardi manage to get everybody beamed up, and they're about to warp away when the magistrate, aka Annika's angry husband, beams on board with some gray shirts and shoots Elnor. And the episode ends on this cliffhanger as this magistrate is wondering out loud what the plaque over Picard's decapitated head will say. Traitor, killed while rescuing a Borg. So that's episode 2. Like I said, I'm not impressed with the quality of storytelling in these first 2 episodes, and I don't enjoy these first 2 episodes with the exception of the bits with Q. I find it annoying how sloppy and kind of now here, now there the presentation is. And as far as the premise, it just seems like they're carelessly mixing concepts between mirror universe and alternate timeline. They're really following the rules of a mirror universe type setup in terms of how there are alternate versions of each person and stuff like that. So the end result is it just feels completely unoriginal, but at the same time, while feeling like a tired rehash of old concepts, it's also like everything's just not quite right. It's just off because they're mixing concepts carelessly. As I was watching it this last time, I jotted down a note to myself partway through the episode that to the effect that it really feels like a last minute, I don't know if it was, but it feels to me like a hasty last minute throw together. Or I put in my little note there, if it's not that, then then I'll change and I'll just say, well, you know what it feels like then? It feels like a cheap fanfic in terms of the story writing aspect. In the sense that if this was a speech I was listening to instead of a show, or if this was an essay that I was reading, I would say that, well, at this point, the speaker's just rambling or the writer's just rambling. This is the fluff. This is the part that you didn't plan properly, so you just put all the fluff out there instead. But since it's not a speech or an essay, since it's a TV series, instead I just kind of look at it and say, what the heck is this? The presentation is pretentious and intense, but the content is paper thin, full of cliches and throwaway elements. And I kept thinking as well, it would make a really nice parody if it wasn't trying so hard to be superficially emotional and intense, which is probably why I keep finding myself using the word pretentious. But on the bright side, it is the setup for a season that becomes quite interesting later on, so I can't complain too much. They introduce Q in a really fun way, and they bring the Borg Queen into the story, and they introduce the key plot elements of going back to 2024, trying to correct the timeline, stuff like that. And I guess that was probably the writer's goals, and then maybe those were what they were really trying to do, and then for some reason all that fluff around those goals became, well, really annoying and hollow fluff. So it'll be fun moving forward in this story to see how our characters can overpower the magistrate and get their ship to time warp around the sun back to 2024. But in the meanwhile, what can we say about this episode in terms of themes, real life implications, or things like that? Since I'm probably never going to be able to finish an episode without saying something about the real world. Well, from the get-go, since it's a fluffier episode, there's not a whole lot of really meaningful takeaways like most Star Trek tends to have. But there are a couple themes playing out which we can make some reference to. One thing I think we can notice right at the get-go is the themes of good and evil, the idea of good and evil within culture, and then genocide. So I think the episode intends to make at least a little bit of a reference to the concept of the cultural relativity of morality and how this relates to the difference between good and evil, as well as certain specific social problems such as genocide. Eradication Day, obviously, it's got a certain genocidal flavor to it. And a culture that, you could say, a culture that loves to celebrate Eradication Day probably also believes in the moral goodness of genocide as well. I read a book on social psychology several years back as part of a school assignment, and a particular chapter in it, cited a number of studies that have been done on the psychology associated with genocide. And they made one interesting observation about a number of studies on the use of the language and concept of thinking of pure evil, or the concept that someone is just evil in a simplistic sense. And so I'm going to give you a couple quotes here. So one study found that the belief that some people are just evil predicted stronger support for a number of violent policies and positions, such as the use of enhanced interrogation techniques at Guantanamo Bay. Another study, and I'm kind of mixing quotes, another study suggested that believing in pure evil predicted stronger levels of support for preemptive military action and the use of torture techniques by the United States. And then the authors suggest near the end of that section, taken together, the work on this topic suggests that some caution is needed when applying the labels of good and evil to groups of people, particularly in situations of mass atrocities, as such rhetoric may serve to legitimize ongoing violence and render any other diplomatic actions less feasible options. They suggest that calling a group evil may undermine the attempt to understand the terror group's recruitment strategies and tactics, thus making it more difficult to overcome this problem. So, one factor that influences how people think and feel about certain kinds of violence may be the kind of language they use and what they believe about the nature of evil in the world. If we think that certain people are just evil, we'll probably be less likely to be able to develop a keen understanding, and we'll probably be more likely instead to support inappropriate kinds of violence. One thing that I think is often accomplished in parallel universe or time travel stories in Star Trek is helping us explore the difference between good and evil in relation to the development of human beings. Now, I'm not sure this episode does the greatest job since so much of the episode is surface level, but in touching on these themes, it does give us an opportunity to reflect about the cultural and situational factors that cause people to develop behaviors, habits, and attitudes that we would have to classify as evil. In some ways, it reminds me of the discussions back in Star Trek Nemesis, in which Picard contemplated whether there really was a fundamental difference between him and his clone, Shinzon, who was evil in terms of his behaviors and intentions. And I think it's a healthy and even a morally and spiritually necessary step for all of us to take to admit the fact that if not for the lot in life that we've been given, we could all be a Shinzon or a General Picard giving his speech on Eradication Day. You know, if not for the lot in life we've been given, we could all be a Shinzon. And we can't take nearly as much credit for our relative goodness, that is, our non-evil habits, actions, and attitudes. We can't take nearly as much credit for that as we would like to think. In that sense, I think there's a little bit of Hitler inside every one of us. There's a little bit of Gul Dukat inside each of us. I think one of the moments that draws these kinds of themes into focus is the line where Seven is out there on stage reading her introduction to Picard's speech. She's reading it on the podium there. And as she goes through the list of all the arrogant things that the Borg should never have done to the Confederation, she comes to the final one on the list, and it's resistance. And Seven just gives you this kind of look. There's this kind of odd moment when she reads that last word, because even though clearly the Borg queen sitting there is just as poisonous and malevolent as she is in any other timeline, but at the same time, here is Seven standing there saying that it's time to eliminate certain people or a person for the crime of resistance, which is, of course, the Borg's favorite word to use while they're doing their heinous versions of Eradication Day. Now, I mean, definitely the point is partly lost on us, partly because of the fact that, let's be honest, in any world, we'd be better off without a devious Borg queen running around. But the point is still being made that it's possible for the winner in a conflict against evil to actually instantly become evil, corrupted by the very acts and habits that it took to gain that victory. It reminds me a little bit not in terms of genocide, but in terms of reversal. It kind of reminds me of the political satire contained in Animal Farm, where not a part of Star Trek. So here I'm breaking my rules and I'm making reference to a story outside of Star Trek. But if you ever heard of or read the fun little satirical fiction Animal Farm, where the animals overturned the tyranny of the farmer under the leadership of the pigs. But over time, those, after they won, so they kicked out the farmer and he ran off. But over time, those pigs, drunk with power and going on using their political manipulation to make power moves and, within the society, it ends up where the pigs just kind of stand up on their hind legs and walk around like farmers because that's the point where they are indistinguishable from the old oppressor, the farmer, except they're actually a little bit worse. And so, in a similar way, I think Seven here is kind of noticing that the self-righteous defeaters of the Borg are, even though they're human, they're starting to look a little bit like just an alternate version of the Borg in human form, and an alternate version of the Borg in terms of their mindset and values and things like that. I think this sequence is probably also intended to implicitly, it's a little less put in your face, but I think it's probably intended implicitly to also raise the question of whether it's appropriate in the first place to be executing the Borg Queen. Our characters have to rescue the Borg Queen for pragmatic reasons, so the episode doesn't end up having an opportunity to tell us what the Starfleet answer would be in terms of whether or not she should be executed. I think you could suggest, as we think about this question, we could suggest the behavior of the Queen throughout the season definitely does underscore the fact that sometimes some evil can't be redeemed without unacceptable loss. I think that's definitely pointed to. We're better off without, we certainly don't want to let her go running around. But at the same time, we could say, on the other hand, the final conclusion of the season does certainly involve the eventual redemption of the Queen, which I think that concept, this element of the redemption of the Borg Queen, you could kind of think of as an implicit case, an implicit argument of the greater to the lesser. So if the very embodiment of evil itself, the Borg Queen, who's about as bad as the skin of evil himself, if even the Queen can be redeemed, then we should maybe always do what we can to seek the redemption of humans who aren't cybernetic monstrosities with recalcitrant poison built into their essence like the Borg Queen. I think that's probably a point that the season as a whole is pretty clearly intended to make. I'd be very surprised if they didn't intend that. Kind of a counterexample to the theme we saw in the Voyager two-part episode Scorpion. And then at the same time, so it's a counterexample to that. And it's also, you could say, a positive extension of the Voyager thread surrounding the theme of redemption. So let's talk about both of those real quick. In Scorpion, back in Voyager, Chakotay, you might remember, Chakotay told Janeway this fable of an animal trying to cross a river with a scorpion on its back who promised not to sting him. And in the middle of the river, the scorpion stings him and he says, "Why did you sting me? Now we'll both drown." And the scorpion says, "It's my nature." And that's Chakotay's epic punchline. "It's my nature." And so Chakotay was using this fable to urge Janeway to not make the deal with the Borg, which Janeway had earlier on when she was in the holodeck. She kind of playfully referred to it as, "Let's make a deal with the devil," And in the end, Chakotay ends up being right in terms of that the Borg do break their promise, just like that scorpion. And the point is well made that no matter how optimistic or humanistic we are, we need to be realistic about the nature of evil, and we need to recognize that trust and goodwill do have their limits. A similar example in Voyager would be the episode Counterpoint, where Janeway extends support to this commanding officer of a Nazi-type group who he claims to have defected, and he says, I need help. Can I come over to you guys?" But in the end, he ends up betraying Voyager and Janeway. But he betrays them only to find out that Janeway had already planned for his betrayal, and she'd set it up so that he wouldn't be able to take advantage of them in the particular way that he intended to. And then in DS9, we could say two of the most evil characters in DS9, Gul Dukat and Kai Wynn, as the story goes on, they both end up being very relatable in certain ways. But in the end, neither one of them can be redeemed, or neither one of them end up being redeemed. But instead, they both kind of demonstrate over and over that they're more likely to feign a change of heart and use that to do irreparable damage than they are to actually have a change of heart. But then I mentioned how this concept also is an extension of themes in Voyager. So Voyager has a repeating theme of the value of redemption and rescue, not only for the underprivileged, like in the episode Good Shepherd, but also for those who are actually engaged in actual evil, such as Lon Suitor and Seven of Nine, who were both evil in terms of their behaviors, but they weren't quote unquote just evil. There were plenty of influences and factors that led to these patterns of behavior and mindset and intentionality. And with the right kind of time and the right kind of caring attention, there is hope for some kind of lasting positive change. And in this season of Picard, it seems like the writers are taking that theme to the most conceivably extreme extent possible by finding a way to redeem the very embodiment of evil and recalcitrance, the Borg Queen herself, who's so bad that she really has more in common with the skin of evil than she does with the humanness of, let's say, Gul Dukat. So anyway, going back to the discussion about good and evil in relation to human development, I think in general, time travel, alternate timeline type stories, as well as mirror universe episodes of Star Trek often do a great job of giving us a reminder just about how contingent we are. And sometimes that plays into the question of good or evil and how we could all be the villain if things were different. And I think this definitely relates as well to the redemption theme, like I mentioned above, and it relates to the writer's decision to redeem the Borg Queen in this season. We could suggest these two themes come together as well. They kind of interrelate to suggest to us the unstable nature of this foundation we think we have of goodness that we see in ourselves, in our own self-righteous selves, or the goodness that we see in our own values or our own culture. If we lived in that world, we would have been part of the crowd cheering on Eradication Day. So suggesting that, as well as suggesting the unstable nature of that foundation we think we see of evil in those who are carrying out evil. So even the Borg Queen can be redeemed in the right complex context. Now, I don't think this particular episode does the greatest job of being a thoughtful Star Trek episode that asks any deep question. But in light of the greater scope of episodes on time travel, mirror universes, the Borg, the redemption themes in Voyager, etc., I think you can definitely see that the choice of themes that were chosen for this season and even those elements of this episode probably did emerge in light of those topics and in light of an intention to feed into those topics and keep on discussing them through the fiction of Star Trek. So anyway, since we started talking about genocide in the context of Eradication Day and the nature of evil, so let's have a little bit of fun here, and let's finish up with the result of some real life studies on what leads to a genocidal society. So what could lead up to you and me being in that crowd, excitedly cheering Picard, General Picard, on Eradication Day? So I'm going to take this from the same book I mentioned before, and this is their chapter on the psychology of genocide. The factors that have been identified as leading up to genocidal acts can be divided into, I think these are probably their major headings, situational, societal, ideological, and psychological factors. Now, I'm getting this from, I didn't have time to actually read through the whole chapter again. I'm basically taking this from the notes that I took on that chapter when I read through it a couple years back. For this next section, I'll be mixing a combination of quotes and then my own summaries of what they were saying. So anyway, so the major categories were situational factors, societal, ideological, and psychological factors. So in terms of background situation, often the society that goes down the path toward atrocities was one that found itself in difficult life's conditions that frustrate basic human needs for security, control, a positive social identity, and meaning. And so these frustrated needs then end up being satisfied down the road in destructive ways, such as scapegoating of certain demographics, and such as following destructive ideologies, which we'll get into in a minute. But then eventually, over the long haul, genocides and mass atrocities gradually develop and unfold. Still talking about situation. Often there's a pre-existing violent context that serves the role of normalizing violence and providing political opportunities for authorities to take extreme measures to deal with those challenges. And then some other political and societal risk factors are previous genocides, an ethnic minority group being in power, low openness to trade, an autocratic government, and everyone being in agreement on one particular set of values and goals as opposed to diversity. And then exclusionary ideologies. So those are some of the situational and societal factors. Then there are the particular ideologies mentioned above that tend to play out and make the atrocities possible down the road. And then after this, we're going to get into the psychological factors. So in terms of ideologies, the first one they listed was an us versus them mindset. But they clarified that this doesn't actually predict aggression. It might not necessarily be followed by patterns of aggression unless it's accompanied by these other ideologies. So what are the other ones? Well, first off, the out group is defined as a problem and an obstacle to a better society. Those certain people are a problem. We'd all be better off if if they would get out of here. Next, we've got exclusion and elimination of that targeted out group serves a higher purpose, namely to achieve a better society. Now, what kind of outgroup would be targeted as the scapegoat in this kind of context, in this kind of way? So they said the type of people or the type of group that would end up being scapegoated like that would be those groups that are stereotyped as powerful and competent as well as cold are chosen as scapegoats. So those groups that are stereotyped as powerful and competent as well as cold are chosen as scapegoats. So those are the ones that are going to get crushed for the good of society. And they say groups selected as scapegoats have often already been historically derogated and blamed, such that there's already a cultural narrative that leaders and other ideologists can easily tap into and activate. Next one here, a belief in the in-group's superiority, cultural and otherwise. So our culture is better than theirs. The next one, a sense of vulnerability. So we are weak, and if we don't protect ourselves, we're going to be in big trouble, that kind of thing. And then the last one here, they say collective narcissism or in-group glorification. So once again, we are it. Our group is the good one. So those ideologies play out on the societal level, since they're ideologies that enter into a culture or emerge within a culture. What about on an individual psychological level? How can people take part in these atrocities? How can they actually do the heinous acts? Or if they're just observers, how can they see it happening and just go along with it? So they give a bunch of answers to that. Number one, habituation and desensitization. So much of behavior can be explained by habituation and desensitization. We do things that we're used to, and we end up being comfortable with anything that we're around enough. As humans, we get used to anything, whether it's going to the Coliseum, or whether it's watching edgy films on Netflix, or whether it's watching the Bajorans get beat up by Cardassians, or whether it's learning to beat up the Bajorans yourself, one small step at a time. You could say, if you've got the capacity to develop a taste for coffee, you probably also have the capacity to develop a taste for cruel violence. So that was number one, habituation and desensitization. Number two, dehumanization of victims. If you remember in Picard season 1, Narissa was always referring to Soji as a thing because she wasn't human. In the same way, any outgroup that's going to be mistreated in this kind of atrocity kind of way is going to end up being thought of, or it's kind of a prerequisite or part of the picture here, that they're going to be referred to as something else. And this is going to affect the kind of language that's used to talk about them. So they're not people. They're not your neighbors. They're scum, maybe, or they're vermin, or they're animals, or something like that. And then third, kind of similarly, the use of euphemisms. For example, using euphemisms to refer to executions. Let's not call them executions. Let's call them something else. Or genocidal plans. We're not planning, to wipe out this entire people group. We'll call it something else. Now, you might remember in the DS9 episode Duet, you might remember how the pretend Maritza, so it wasn't actually Maritza, but he was pretending to be Maritza, pretending to be the leader of this, these atrocities. But anyway, so he was kind of bragging about how the Cardassian soldiers, they would be told to go off and do some horrible atrocity, and they'd feel uncomfortable, but they'd head off and do what they were told. But then they'd come back feeling better about themselves because they had helped in cleansing and purifying. And so they felt clean and they felt better, that kind of thing. So that's what we're talking about right there. The narrative that the Cardassians were living out the narrative involved a use of a different kind of language. We aren't torturing and murdering individuals. We're purifying society. So that was the third one. Number 4, there were often individual motives. Some individuals can be motivated by, and the two that they listed were sadism and instrumentalism. Sadism, getting sadistic pleasure from harming other people, can be a motive. But they note one scholar who suggests that this is presumably a rather minor factor limited to a few individual cases. But he suggests instrumental gain, on the other hand, is a much more common motive. Often individuals just had things to gain by being involved in this corrupt system, by supporting its atrocities, one small step or large step at a time. And then finally, the last thing they put on their list was ordinary psychological processes such as obedience and conformity, or the need for security and control. So everyone needs to feel safe and in control of their lives. And when society is moving in a certain direction, you either cooperate or you stand out. And the factors of obedience and conformity are definitely very significant factors that I think a lot of the time we kind of under recognize. And social psychology studies have definitely increasingly been discovering how powerful the factors of obedience and conformity really are. So, for example, there's one really well-known study, and I didn't have time to look it up or put anything down, but this is just kind of from my memory of the way it works, is that, and I don't know if this was the 70s or the 80s or 2000s or what, but it was done a while back and involved having the test subject putting him in this little room and having him push a button, which would supposedly subject another person in a different room to this really painful shock. And then as the study goes on, we're going to increase the shock. And the other person's in a different room, but you can hear him through the intercom. But what the psychologists would do is provide a fake audio channel, so it seems like the test subject is really shocking and hurting the other person, but he actually isn't. And so when they set up the study and actually carried it out, it turned out that most people would keep pushing the shock button far beyond what that individual would normally feel good about, but he would keep pushing the button if they were instructed by the authority figure running the test to do so. So as humans, we really are structured within our society by means of the psychological processes of obedience and conformity. And it's a lot easier for us to judge people in corrupt societies for their actions of going along with things. It's a lot easier for us to judge them, even though in many cases we would probably end up doing similar things, especially if we weren't sure what we're actually dealing with. So Picard, in our story here, he's totally repulsed by the line that says, "A safe galaxy is a human galaxy." 7 of 9 couldn't believe that there's such a thing as Eradication Day. She couldn't believe her speech that condemned other people for resistance. But within that society, most people like you and me, would have been in that crowd, or maybe watching from their TV, but they would have been in that crowd cheering along, celebrating Eradication Day. Fortunately for Picard and friends, we've got a plan to set things straight, and all it takes is a little bit of time travel, a fun little mixture of First Contact and Future's End. Remember that Voyager episode where they went back to 1996? Got a fun little combo of those two story elements. And after that happens, there's not going to be any more General Picard, no more Eradication Day. Instead, we'll get a utopian federation and a Starfleet that believes in cooperation and friendship and peace. And man, after visiting this utopia, I bet all of our characters are gonna be really excited about the fact that the Federation's worth fighting for. So anyway, those are some of my thoughts on Picard Season 2, Episode 2, Penance, and a little bit of thoughts on good and evil and genocide. If you want more discussions on the overlap where sci-fi and fantasy meet with other topics like psychology, philosophy, and spirituality, then go ahead and hit that subscribe button. But I'll see you in the next one.